Living in Des Moines, growing up in Iowa, you're used to hearing about tornadoes this time of year.
Yeah.
But tell me about just kind of what that shift was like, what you were doing, and when you kind of realized that, like, oh, this is different, like this could be really serious.
Yeah. So there had been a lot of weather events earlier in that day as well. So we'd actually already been in the storm shelter once earlier in the morning, and everything kind of blew by, and we were just able to shelter all of our patients at that time. So it was kind of nice because we had a little bit of a dry run prior to, and then we knew how to get everybody there, and the nurses who I was working with were super effective with communicating with the patients and their family. But I'll be honest with you, being an Iowan, I don't know how many tornado warnings I've undergone between like elementary school on up, and but prior to moving back to Iowa, I lived in Kansas, so no stranger to that. And basically, you hear the sirens, you know that there's the chance, but the idea of like this tornado then coming and to so close proximity to your facility is something that I guess I just never anticipated happening. So luckily we actually had a radio in the ER, so we had live updates from the storm spotters around town. And both of our ambulances were actually out doing storm spotting to help with the fire department. So they were not at the EMS house or at the hospital where they normally might be, which ended up being really great because then we were able to use them to transport and help us triage patients once the ER wasn't usable. But because we had that radio, we were able to hear live updates of where the tornado was. And one of our, I don't live in Greenfield, so I know the general layout and the streets, but I don't know all of the streets. And so we were hearing updates as they got kind of closer and closer. And one of the nurses who lives in the area, she was like, okay, it's on the path to us. And like her face was very stone cold, very serious. And that's when we were already all in the shelter, and we had been there so we had the tornado I think hit at like 3:40, 3:41 to the hospital. Mm-hmm. And we had all been in the shelter at basically right after 3 because that's when we got the warning, and that's when we were moved patients safely there. So we had been in there for quite some time, and so we were very prepared. But that's, minutes before, that's when we were like, okay, this is happening. And we had already made a plan between myself and the nurses, sort of what we were going to do, if there was a large event and how we would handle the patients. But we weren't really anticipating damage to the hospital itself. So we kind of had to pivot from there. But I think everybody stepped up, and we were able to keep all the patients that were in the ER and all of their family safe and protected. So that was really a great feeling.
Yeah. And is what you saw and heard kind of similar to what you've always heard about, like in movies and stuff like that?
Yeah. So, it was all happening very quickly, but in the minutes that we heard on the radio and the nurse, basically said, it's on a direct path to us. That's when, I think, everybody was kind of like, okay, take a deep breath. And I was trying to remain positive. And then basically, the lights went off in the room that we were in, and then the generator kicked on, so the lights came back on, and then one of the pharmacy techs who was in the room with us, she said, oh, I think that's just the air handler turning back on. And so I'm naive and I believed her, but it kept getting louder and louder, and it didn't quiet down. So that's when I realized that was the tornado passing, probably the periphery of the tornado hitting us, but just kind of right by us. It's exactly what they describe it as. It sounds like a freight train. It was gone and it came and went in a matter of, 10 seconds, but that you're not even really processing it, that it's hitting before you realize, and then it's gone. And luckily, because we were in a secure storm shelter room, we didn't have any windows, and we were surrounded by concrete on all sides. But the moment I stepped out of the room, the ER window that leads to that hallway was busted out, and the house basically next door that now has a field in it, the roof was completely gone, and there was debris and trees on the floor. That's when I realized, okay, there's, but I couldn't even see the front of the hospital, which is where the majority of the damage was, right next to us. So you start kind of, then your wheels are turning, but you don't even, you're delayed in your processing because it's like happening to you in real time.
Yeah. So what did you do next? How do you keep patients calm in that scenario? Because obviously you guys ultimately did have to kind of move operations to the school. So how did that all happen?
So the first thing is like myself and there was a respiratory therapist working that day. We were the first to leave the room, and that's when I saw the debris and the window was blown out, and I saw the damage to the home next door. So I knew something was, there was serious damage to the town, but I didn't know what extent. But the problem was I went to one of the ER rooms and there was water all over the floor, and then down the hallway you could see almost like a sort of a smoke filling the hallways, and so there was sprinklers going, and there was obviously a variety of things going on. So that's when I realized that there was probably some damage at some point. I didn't know if there was a fire. I didn't know exactly what was happening, but I didn't feel like it was going to be safe to have patients here in our ER. So we did later realize that there was damage to some sort of gas thing that sits on the roof that was causing that. So my first priority was to get people out of the hospital because I didn't want anyone to get injured if there was a fire or anything like that. So I, with the help of nurses and other staff that was working down further, we were able to evacuate everyone out. And then the second thing I did was I was the provider working in the ED that day, but there was 2 other providers working down the clinic. So I ran down the stairs. I told them, there's people flooding into our waiting room. I need you guys upstairs right now because on that side of the hospital, there wasn't as much, you can't visualize as much. And so they saw the damage to their cars and everything, and they made sure obviously their clinic patients were all okay that were sheltering, but immediately they came upstairs with me. So the 3 of us basically, we walked out the front doors that we kind of entered through, and that's when we saw basically everything was leveled in front of the hospital, and people were just walking up that hill, patients and injured people, and people just completely covered in debris. You couldn't even recognize people. Later found out like one of our staff's kids was included, and like I didn't even recognize them because they were covered in debris. And also just trying to keep them from coming into the hospital because we didn't know what was leaking, we didn't know if it was safe. And so initially we did kind of we didn't have great communication that we could get in touch with where we were going to put people. And as you know from seeing the town, there was debris all over all the roadways. So we had to work with our EMS to try to figure out where could they get to. So initially we actually were up at the Casey's because we actually had that area cleared enough that people could get to it. And my thought was, if we get people up there, we were close to several major highways that were not affected because going north was basically impossible at that moment. And so if we could get people down to Creston or to Winterset, that was my thinking. So initially we were up at Casey's, but there was also an effort by the EMS chief and the fire department to then establish a triage center at the lumber center. And so we moved to the lumber yard parking lot. So we consolidated both triage areas from there. And then as the evening went on, first of all, the lumber store was so amazing they gave us so many supplies. They just opened their doors to us. They allowed us to triage people, and the response from all of the counties surrounding, and they're sending their EMS and ambulances. We had providers and doctors coming from Des Moines, from Blank, from Mercy, from all corners of like the state. Nurses, just like the response was amazing because those of us who were affected and you work through it, the adrenaline kicks in and you do what you have to do, but it was also nice to have a second set of hands and eyes to kind of then sort of like as you kind of come down from that to help. So then after that, the evening kind of progressed on. That's when the efforts started to transition to getting something more permanent set up at the school. And so following that day, all of my shifts that we were working at and the triage that continued to happen in the next 24 hours was all happening at the school. But then we were able to then get a lot of our materials that were not affected or damaged from the storm. We were able to get those loaded up in people's trucks and whatever we could find, and then over the school so that we would have all those tools to then help people as much as possible.
Yeah, definitely. It just sounds like just a crazy, chaotic couple of days. I know there was of course some fatalities, but yeah, like 35 people injured. So I've always been kind of curious about just how that, you people coming in, you're trying to get as many people out too.
Right.
I don't know if you know kind of how many people you had in the emergency department at that time.
Before the damage.
Yeah.
So we had 4 people who were in our emergency department. Luckily, all of them were like stable and actually like mostly ready for discharge, waiting a few tests. So we got really lucky in that way that all of them were able to walk, talk, and none of them were in critical condition. So we actually were able to sort of discharge all of them following that. We did not have to triage or send any of our ER patients on to another ER. And they were all followed up with from outpatient providers following the tornado. So that was one thing that just the timing worked out, that all of them were in stable condition, and that worked out in our favor in that way. And everybody was obviously very understanding of the circumstances. It's not something that you really can anticipate. And so, they understood that they're stable. They, and some of the people actually in the ER with us that day, ended up losing their homes. So almost like it was sort of, that it was actually they were safer, honestly, here, because I know that one of them didn't even have a basement in their home. So they were, I'm sure processing a lot of things on their own, and like I said, stable enough that they were able to discharge from there, that we didn't have to send them on. So that was very lucky in that way.
Absolutely, yeah. And what sort of looking back on this now, in this room that we're standing in, there are changes, there are things that have been rebuilt since the tornado. Reflecting on all the progress that the hospital has made, what's changed? Does it feel different coming into work?
Honestly, no. I mean, I feel like if anything, everybody grew closer in that day. I mean, you're trusting your life with these people. Well, and those of us, myself and the nurses and other staff that were working that day that were in that room, we I feel like I'm closer with them on a level I never expected to be, because that's definitely an event that changes your perspective on things. I think there was I live in, there was another storm warning a couple days later, and you better believe I was in my basement. And so, in that way, in terms of the personnel, not speaking on the reconstruction of the hospital, but the personnel, it just felt like everybody really pulled their weight. And I can even speak for registration staff. They were out there with pens and papers trying their best to get identifiers from patients that we were then sending on to other locations. And the amount of teamwork and people stepping up and just helping, even if they weren't clinical staff, and helping in any way that they could, helping me run down and get wheelchairs so we could get people up from in front of the hospital, people showing up with their 4x4s, people showing up with, I don't know all the terms of all the excavators and stuff, but showing up and just clearing the road so ambulances could get into us. I mean, I grew up in the suburbs, and so this is not something where people just have a 4x4 in their garage or a little excavator in their garage. And so having people in a town like this, honestly, I've told people since the tornado, it's amazing because it's a small town. They stepped up. They brought their resources that they had to make an impact, even if that was big or small. In terms of coming back to work, and did it feel the same or did it feel different? I feel like I said, I feel closer to my colleagues. And I mean, the hospital by and large, I feel like if anything is improved, and we're just, it brought a lot of people closer. And so then, you've got this higher level of bonding. And so then it makes it almost your job that much easier. And I do think that there's been some improvements, with things that, we were able to have some input in the process, and us and the other providers and doctors who work, and things that, just little tweaks here and there. Hey, this would be helpful, or this type of flooring would be nice. That really it wasn't a huge change, but it definitely, having that input. And then I just feel like our facilities are that much better to serve the community.
Yeah, and you were going through IVF treatments at this time, a little bit before the tornado hit. Obviously now you have your daughter. Sort of reflecting back on all of this, are there any lessons or just things that you're sort of taking away from that experience? Because like you said, you always kind of grow up knowing about it, but you always think it's not going to happen to me, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, now lesson number one is it can happen, and you need to take all warnings seriously. Even if you think it's 1,000 times it hasn't happened, it doesn't mean it can't happen the one time. And I just take like life, I'm just very happy that we were able to make it through that. And it's not easy to have gone through something like that, but we also are lucky that the hospital offered so many resources for those of us who were affected by the tornado, whether it be mental health, people to talk to, emergency counselors to talk with about the event, and just having those resources. So like those of us, we were so set on just trying to help as many people as possible to just process it, and that helped a lot. And those resources have continued. They I know that they've had other they still have resources for people who are still dealing with the trauma, and also those of us who maybe the anniversary coming up may be impactful. It also just kind of gives you, I don't want to say it gives you a new lease on life, but it definitely gives you perspective about, the important things in your life. And I'm very grateful that, I was safe that day, and I was able to kind of continue on and end up having my baby. And, also then once you have a child, it's like a whole other thing. You're worrying not just about your own safety, but your safety so that you can go back to them every night. But I'm very grateful that it all worked out, that she could come along.
Definitely.